Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Kyla Hannington, the Outreach Coordinator with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. We are thrilled to be partnering with Prince George's County Memorial Library System and NewSouth Books in bringing you tonight's conversation with Bob Mayer about his inspiring new book, In the Name of Emmett Till. Robert H. Mayer is an award-winning author who wrote When the Children Marched, the Birmingham Civil Rights Movement, and edited the Civil Rights Act of 1964. His new book that he's joining us to speak about tonight, In the Name of Emmett Till, was published by NewSouth Books in September of this year. Mayer grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. He has lived in Pennsylvania his entire adult life as a social studies teacher in Lewisburg, and then a professor of education at Moravian College in Bethlehem. He has an MA in history from Xavier University in Cincinnati and a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the Pennsylvania State University and State College. Retiring after 41 years of teaching, he now researches and writes most of the day, living in Bethlehem with his wife Jan and his cat Lucy, and he still teaches a little. Co-hosting tonight's conversation is Renee Battlebrooks, the Executive Director of the Office of Human Rights. So welcome to you both.
Thank you, Kyla. And thank you, Bob, for joining us. This book, let's see if my lighting is right. This book is an amazing book. Everyone should read this. It really lays out a lot of different vignettes and some that, you've read and then it plugs in so you can see the chronology. But tell us a little bit about your work and what inspired you to write this book.
Well, the book is In the Name of Emmett Till, How the Children of the Mississippi Freedom Struggle Showed Us Tomorrow. So in the name of Emmett Till, I start chapter 1 talking about the tragic story of Emmett Till. And then the story of his murder hovers over the book throughout the rest of it, but we switched to looking at the young people of Mississippi who reacted to the murder of Emmett Till. Many of them were his age or around his age and just were profoundly affected by his murder. And they went ahead and became very politically active. So in writing the book, what I'm hoping is to share the stories of all of these amazing young people who became active to fight to end the sort of world that allowed the murder of Emmett Till. I was inspired to write it by going back to my years. I taught high school for 12 years. I taught history, and teaching history to ninth graders is not an easy thing. They don't always resonate. My students didn't always resonate to history, and so I struggled to find ways to make it exciting to them. As a writer, I stumbled upon, and I did some of this when I taught, I stumbled upon the idea, well, let's look for events in history that involve young people. And so first I wrote When the Children Marched, about the Birmingham children and their marches. And as I was researching that, I found that the same, and even more so, happened in Mississippi, that the young people became involved and became, in many ways, the center of the movement. So I stumbled upon that. And once I begin to learn about them, it becomes inspirational reading about them.
Yeah, and a couple of things. One, thank you so much. What you did for 40 years is amazing, and we need this. Teachers are our foundation. I mean, I can't overstate, so thank you. And then history. For those who know me, I'm a little bit of a history nerd. I think history is so important. It is so foundational. There's that word again. It really is. The phrase that we hear often enough is that history repeats itself if we're not careful to understand. And I think what strikes me about the book and what strikes me about what you said in terms of making history more relevant or interesting. What words would you have with not just our young people now, but sort of everyone seems to be asleep, and that history is not important. Yet I feel like in the middle of this crisis, and I keep wanting to scream, wake up, right? We're just repeating patterns that are there for us to learn from. What words of advice and or hope can you give us?
Oh, I'll have to, in terms of teaching history and thinking about history, in addition to the repetition, there's the continuity within history, and we so much need that to understand that continuity, to understand what's happening today. So an instance like what happened, George Floyd's murder or Trayvon Martin's murder, those events, there's a historic footprint to both of them. I think with Trayvon Martin, it connects directly to Emmett Till. There's a young man who was killed. I guess the hope comes in both instances. The children who responded to Emmett Till, but then Trayvon Martin, the Black Lives Matter movement grew out of that. So it seems like these events that happen that are just tragic, people respond in ways that are hopeful. So I think that's where I would see the hope.
Yeah, that's great. You painted lots of sketches of just fascinating children, beings, persons that had such courage and strength. And even if they didn't start off courageous, maybe, as some grew into it because of curiosity or something that was different. Speaking, later in the book in Greenwood, and just maybe paint for us a picture, maybe 2 sketches of some of the young people, something that you found different that you didn't know, or something interesting about 2 sketches and how that changed the trajectory of something.
Sure. I love telling the story of Brenda Travis, if that would get us started.
Oh, she was one of the people I had written down to be like, tell us more about this person. So I'd love to hear about her.
I will. I'll preface it by saying she has a video presence on the internet, and so I can talk about her, but then people can go and hear her tell her own story. And also, she wrote a memoir that was also published by NewSouth Books. But I find myself just drawn to her story. It's so powerful, and that would be a hopeful story too. She was 10 when Emmett Till was murdered, and at 10, she said, I will do something about this someday, one day," she said. And 6 years later, she's 16, and she decides, okay, the time has come. And she hooks up with, first, one of the older people in her community. She lived in McComb, Mississippi, in the southern part of the state. And C.C. Bryant, who was the head of the NAACP in McComb, she connected with him. And then Bob Moses, the great Bob Moses, who we just lost about a month ago, he comes to McComb, and that is where he begins his organizing. He's organizing a voter registration march or drive, and Brenda Travis becomes involved with it. She's a teenager, 16, but she's going door to door in the hot Mississippi sun, and she's asking people to go down to the McComb courthouse to register. So she's doing that, but she's starting to get frustrated because people are reluctant to go down for good reason. Going to register, people can get fired. That was one tactic used to keep people from going down. Some people get beaten going down. And then there's all kinds of humiliating methods to keep African Americans from being able to successfully register. So people are, she'll come to the door and people won't answer because they just don't want to deal with it. So she's getting frustrated and decides, okay, I'm going to do more direct action, things like sit-ins and marches. So she decides she's going to do a sit-in. Right, she's going to do a sit-in. She's going to basically, to expand that, she's going to invade a white space. And she and two of her teen colleagues, two young men, they go down to the Greyhound station in McComb. They go into the white section of the station, and Miss Travis, she heads over to the ticket counter, the white ticket counter, to buy a ticket. Before she can do that, she gets arrested, and she spends 29 days in jail. When she gets out, she returns to her high school. She goes to the principal's office to re-enroll, and he informs her that the white superintendent has ordered that she be expelled for her civil rights activities. And so she's dismayed, but in the high school, here's something hopeful. In the high school, the word gets around that Brenda Travis has been expelled for civil rights activities. And the students are angered. And 114 of them walk out of the high school with her, in support of her. So I'll stop at that point because that's a hopeful moment. And that's a story that, for me, exemplifies what the children in general, and one of the stories that is close to my heart.
Yeah, I feel like that was one of the things. I mean, throughout this whole book, it's stories of people and young people, and what we say regular people, who are just doing incredible acts that have such profound change and that resonate today, continue to resonate. And some of those people, and we've talked about Bob Zellner, who you talk about, and Renee and I were very fortunate and got to talk to him last month, who are continuing, like that work has not stopped, like that individual and so many other people like him who started, in 1959, 1960, 1961, and are just still continuing to do incredible work. And I find that hopeful. So Renee and I have symmetry in our questions, because that was one of the things that I had, was just, I know that there were people watching who may feel some powerlessness. And I think, like, in this moment, but I also think that's part of being human, is sometimes we feel like it's something that everybody else does, and we wish we could be one of those people. And I feel like you've captured these stories that show that any of us can be one of these people.
That's right. And I tell the context, or I try to tell some of the context of what these young people and all people at that time are living through, but in particular the young people, what they're experiencing. So I include the use of the N-word from the mouths of people. They're always quoted because I want to create that world, even though I'm sure it's going to create some discomfort for people to read about that world. But I think that's a starting place to then see how, and here's a question I would ask if I were teaching this book in my history class. How is it that the young people were able to live in the context of the use of the N-word and the murder of Emmett Till, and then rise up and become politically active. So that's, I mentioned that. I think that the ugliness of the world they lived in, and it just exemplifies how amazing these young people were, how brave they were.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. When I think about what you said, and I think about the Ladner sisters and how, their tale is woven all through your book. They start here and then they pop up here. Speak a little bit about them and tell those that are listening about their greatness, that constant drum that's beating.
Yeah, they're like Bob Zellner. They're two people who are still active. Their voices are very much heard, and they started very early on. They grew up in Palmer's Crossing, which is in Hattiesburg, and from a very early age, they were engaged and involved. It was Joyce who was terribly disturbed when Emmett Till was murdered, and would go down to the grocery store every day and get the newspaper and cut out the stories about Emmett Till. So she had that. And at a young age, they also read a lot about the situation in the world, and they observed the situation in their world. So they get involved early on in the NAACP youth councils. And as a result, they become connected with another great person, another person that we should be teaching in schools, Medgar Evers. And they become involved with him, and they continue their civil rights activities. They're doing all kinds of things. There's a group or an event I can talk about later, the Tougaloo Nine, a group of college students, very active, and they were at Jackson State University in Jackson when the Tougaloo Nine were involved, and they very bravely supported them, got the students at Jackson State to support them. It was not encouraged at Jackson State. They got in some trouble for doing it, and they would have been thrown out of school, but then they transferred over to Tougaloo. And then they continued. They got involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and got involved in the state. So yes, they're throughout. And Joyce Ladner is the one I quote who says, "We are the Emmett Till generation."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's it struck something that you said. I want to come back and visit for a moment when you said, I wish that we taught more about Medgar Evers in history, and this whole notion of history, and really what we're not taught in school. And how do we as citizens that have power as a corporate group, citizens, we, the grassroots, how do we start to demand truth in history in schools? It's a big issue, but I remember in my history books, there were some things I was like eager to get to, and literally there was one paragraph and then we moved on. And I'm thinking, I felt, this was in high school, I felt cheated. And again, to me, history is so important. You have to understand who you are, where you came from, so that you can make informed choices, decisions, understand the roadmap. So how do we get that in our schools?
That's a big question, and in the context of our moment where people are saying, let's not teach critical race theory and all of that conversation. It's interesting when I've only paid attention to that conversation through the media. People who are saying don't teach critical race theory, when they're confronted and they say, well, should we teach Black history at all? And they say, oh yeah, we want Black history to be taught. So I see that as the start of the conversation. That's right. We need to be teaching Black history in the school. So I think we all need to pay attention. If it's happening in our communities where people are trying to stop, or in the States, stop the teaching of what they're saying, critical race theory, then we need to engage in that conversation. Let's teach Black history. People are not saying, don't teach that. So let's do it. I would talk directly to teachers about it. I know that one of the things I'm currently doing, not right this moment because of the pandemic, but I've been going and tutoring at a local middle school. And I find that the teachers I'm working with are so receptive to teaching Black literature, Black history. So talking to them, and they may or may not know about somebody like Medgar Evers or Bob Moses or Ella Baker, another one that we should be teaching about. So talking directly to teachers would be something that I would suggest. So, but yeah, I'm so frustrated by all of the conversation now, but we need to make sure that we're doing more. And you mentioned the notion of talking about teaching the truth. We need to also support our teachers who are teaching the truth and getting in trouble for it. So we need to watch for that as well.
That's such a good point. And I'm always fascinated, sort of Black history is American history. And so I want to, sort of talking about the truth, it's only one part of the truth. And so weren't we taught as children that if you tell part of the truth, it's actually a lie because it's not the whole truth, right? So anyway, Kyla, it's your turn.
That's right.
Well, I actually wanted to ask you about someone, and you've mentioned him a couple times, and I know that he's a foundational person in civil rights, but unless you're have had the opportunity to be exposed to his name and his work, a lot of people haven't heard of him and don't know what he's done, which is Bob Moses. And I know that for those of us, we may feel really familiar with Bob Moses, but I also know that I didn't know about Bob Moses. I'm 47 years old. For one more month. Yeah. And I have learned about Bob Moses really very recently, like in the last 5 years of my life. So I don't think I'm alone in that. And so I'm hoping you can, for people watching, and maybe all of you watching are a lot more educated than I was, but I'll speak for myself. And I would love if you could introduce people to just his incredible legacy and work.
Sure. And like Brenda Travis, Bob Moses is a real presence in the internet. And so if you Google him, you can hear him being interviewed and talking a lot about Mississippi, and hearing him talk about it is incredible. One of the things you'll notice right away when you hear him talking is he's an intellectual. He's brilliant, but at the same time, he's an activist. And then I would add, going back to the intellectual, we think of them as intellectuals, as cold people. He is, anybody who knew him from the days of organizing, he is a warm-hearted individual as well. But when you hear him talking, there's a brilliance to what he says. So Bob Moses is actually not from the South. He grew up in Harlem. He grew up in New York City. And he saw in the news the people who were sitting in Greensboro, North Carolina, and he saw the start of that sit-in movement and was very taken by it, and decided he wanted to become politically involved. And he slowly got involved, and eventually he goes down to Atlanta to connect with the young people, with the students. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that is developing. In 1961, this happens. And there's where he encounters Ella Baker, who just schools him in how to organize. She is from the school of going door to door, working with the people, not necessarily being that charismatic leader who leads, but gets behind people and pushes them forward to lead. And she schools him in that method. And he goes to Mississippi, and there he encounters more people. He encounters a World War II vet, Amzie Moore, in Cleveland, Mississippi, and that's the beginning of his organizing. And then he goes down to McComb and begins there. And the movement, the voter registration movement, and the whole movement in Mississippi in the 1960s really starts there with what Bob Moses did. I say that, but with the caveat of all these people who came before, like Amzie Moore and Ella Baker, who set the stage. And and this makes me come back to something that Renee had mentioned before, in terms of Black history being American history. What Bob Moses and Ella Baker were all about, and Amzie Moore were about creating democracy. And the democratic experiment, it started long ago, but it's a work in progress. And I think of people like Bob Moses and Ella Baker as continuing the work of the founders. So if we're teaching democracy, about democracy and civics in our schools, we need to be teaching about what happened in places like Mississippi and teach people about people like Bob Moses.
I was just reminded of so another person that Renee and I were fortunate to talk to, NewSouth Books. So when we're doing this partnership with NewSouth Books, and another wonderful author that we had from that publishing house was Ken Woodley. And there was part of his book where he talks about, and you've really echoed it here, which is this, looking at democracy as we're constantly working on that and building democracy. And so from Ken Woodley, and I'm going to misquote Mr. Woodley, but there's part in his book where he says that the founding of the nation continues. And so that there are people that he talks about in his book who he considers the founding mothers of democracy because they're doing it right. And I think that your book, and you're telling young people, you're telling all of us readers that we too are founding people with the founders of democracy as we're constantly negotiating it. Is that's sort of what I hear you saying.
That's right. That's very true. I like that expression, founders of democracy. And it's it is in certain respects reinventing democracy. Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of what Ella Baker gave to Bob Moses and what he did, it's there's a book, John Dittmer, the historian, wrote a book. It's called Local People, and it's about the Mississippi movement. So this reinventing of democracy is saying democracy is not sitting around and waiting for leaders to do things. Sometimes that's the way it's taught in school. That Lyndon Baines Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that was, he gave this to everybody. But the truth is, people in the communities were fighting for it for a long, long time. So I think of people like Ella Baker and Bob Moses creating the groundwork that pushes people like Lyndon Johnson to finally do the right thing after many years. So yes, that's very much that notion of continuing founders of democracy. I think of those people, and then I'm talking a lot about the older people, but again, it's the young people in my book who are the heroes. They're living in these very terrifying conditions, and they are so brave, and so they too are founders of democracy. They are standing up.
Yeah. And that's hopeful. Going back to Renee, that's hopeful if we think that we recognize that we each collectively and the young people, like we get to build, it's not too late. And that's inspiring and empowering.
It really is. And you know what you said just now, Bob, reminds me of Hezekiah Watkins, this young 13-year-old. Talk to us about that and sort of where he was jailed and what that place represented.
Right. Well, ironically, his trouble starts when he's 13. He's curious. He lives in Jackson, and Jackson, Mississippi, is where the Freedom Rides are coming to and ending. The Freedom Riders are coming to the Jackson bus stations and getting arrested. And many of them are ending up where Hezekiah Watkins ends up at Parchman Farm. So Hezekiah Watkins is 13 and he's with his friend. They're not necessarily activists. They're curious. And they go down to the Greyhound station, much for Hezekiah Watkins against his mother's urging or advice or demand. And they go and they look in, and his friend, not exactly sure, but it seems like his friend gave him a gentle shove. He ends up in the station, and as a result, he gets arrested. He's 13. And with the riders, he is sent to Parchman Farm, which is this notorious prison in Mississippi. Some of the hardest criminals are sent there. And the Freedom Riders were sent there to scare them, which it didn't do, but they were sent there. Eventually, Hezekiah, the governor of the state, realizes they made a terrible mistake, and he gets released fairly quickly. And when he gets out, he connects with some of the other Freedom Riders, James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette, and they start to talk to him about the world he lives in. They become his teachers and try to help him see the broader world. And as a result, he becomes very politically active, and he remains politically active today. He got involved in, there was the walkouts from the high schools. He gets involved with that. And then he goes on to organizing throughout the state with SNCC. And he's still involved. I would have met him if I could have gone down to Jackson, I believe, but he's involved with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, trying to get a lot of this history out.
It's fascinating, one shove changes everything.
Entire life, totally different.
Yeah.
No.
I did just what you said. I found it fascinating that after this, he's a child. After he is arrested, put in with, I read somewhere where you described it, put into the same cell block or cells with those on death row and murderers. Talk about horrible injustice and tactics for a child. But that he still is a child and doesn't understand. And so, as you said, people in the movement are trying to sort of help him process and interpret what happened. It's fascinating that, here's somebody literally grabbed up and doesn't understand what the storm he has landed in is. So
that's right. But it was fairly easy for him to see it. Living in a Jim Crow world, and this was one of the reasons I saw this when I studied Birmingham and wrote about Birmingham, is that the Jim Crow world, the complete lack of justice affected everybody, including the children. Yeah. So it was easy for James Bevel to say, just look around your world, see the water fountain, look at you can't sit down in the zoo. You have to go upstairs at the movie theater. if you go to the if you go to the store to buy clothes, you can't try them on. You take them home, and if they don't fit, you can't return them. So there are young people living in that world. So James Bevel could just, it was easy for him to say, just look around at your world, and then he became involved.
Yeah, and I was struck by another vignette that you talked about. I don't remember her name, but sort of similar, where this is just my life, much like sort of a intimate violence partnership or something where this is, I'm used to this. This is, this is normal.
I think you're talking about Andesha Ida Mae Holland.
Probably.
That was.
Go ahead, Ty.
I was like, she was on my list, and when you were describing her, I thought, oh, I think I know who this is. And so, but I would love to. I mean, she's on my list of people that I was hoping that you could talk about, because she's another incredibly inspiring, powerful story.
Yes, it is. And again, I first was introduced to her. She is in a documentary called Freedom on My Mind. And it's about the Mississippi movement, and it's mainly letting people talk about it. But she is such a presence in that documentary, and she just comes alive there. So at 11, she is raped by her white employer, and she makes that statement. She doesn't even tell her mother, because she says that's the way it is. And she goes on. At 13, she becomes a prostitute. She gets thrown out of her high school. She's being jailed because of prostitution. So that's her life up until about 18. And then at 18, this is kind of like Hezekiah Watkins. This was a good stumbling. She stumbles into this is Greenwood. She stumbles into the SNCC office in Greenwood, and that turns her life around, because she meets Bob Moses, she meets other amazing people, and she becomes involved with a movement. And one of the things she discovers is she has this low opinion of herself, and she has a low opinion of Black people in general. And she learns things like, first of all, she sees in the SNCC office people who are quite competent, doing great things. And she learns things like, well, there are Black writers. Richard Wright, who is from Jackson, from Mississippi. She finds out about Richard Wright. She gets involved with the movement, and it completely transforms her. She becomes involved in voter registration. She's giving literacy classes so people can go down and register to vote. She's leading marches. She starts to go to jail again, but this time it's for good trouble, and she just becomes very involved in the movement. She eventually goes on and earns a doctorate at the University of Minnesota in American Studies. And she writes her memoir, which also is a play called, I'm going to get it wrong, I think it's in the Mississippi Delta. But if you look up Andesha Ida Mae Holland, you can find her memoir as well, which is another source that I would highly recommend. But yeah, she is amazing.
I'm sorry, Kyle.
No, go ahead. But
I'll just ask you, just really quickly. I want you to take us back to Greenwood, because you mentioned that, and it was fascinating that Greenwood is this pivotal place when it comes to Emmett Till, right? And then we come back to Greenwood, and we have, I think it was Bob Moses trying to organize, and the talk about sort of the community and how they were not interested. And sort of that transition, and talk to us about it, because to me that's sort of a microcosm of everything.
That's right. That it is, and it's one of those places where if we talked about Greenwood in a classroom, it is a study in democracy and how democracy should work. It started with this a gentleman by the name of Sam Block, and he is connecting with Bob Moses and Amzie Moore in Cleveland, Mississippi. And Sam Block is from Cleveland, Mississippi. Bob Moses invites him to start a voter registration drive somewhere, and he picks Greenwood because it's close to where Emmett Till was murdered. And he goes into Greenwood by himself. Bob Moses drops him off there, and he goes to the pool halls, he goes to the grocery stores, and he he meets the people. And once he gets to know them a little, he starts to talk about voter registration. And soon he finds people who gives him space. He gets an Elks Hall where he can start to hold meetings, and people start to come to those meetings where he talks about voter registration. And he meets all kinds of problems. There's initially that within the Black community, there's a reluctance to get involved. But with the white community, he's met with a brutality, especially as he becomes more successful. But he persists. He's beaten. He is arrested, jailed, but he persists. And because he held on, that movement happens and it grows. It becomes a big movement. Probably many people are too young to remember the comedian Dick Gregory. But Dick Gregory was a comedian from Chicago who was very popular. He was on all of the TV shows, but he became involved with civil rights, and he comes down to Greenwood to support it. So it becomes this big movement that starts because this young man at 23, Sam Block, persists in creating it. Greenwood is an amazing story, and it's one that I want to find out more. I got to visit Greenwood. I spent some time in Mississippi, and it also, takes us out of this moment, but it's also the place where Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, gives his famous Black Power speech. So it is a very important place.
Wow. Kyla.
Well, I wanted to circle back on something because I think this was another major thread that was throughout the book, and I think throughout the movement. And you said it as it related to Hezekiah Watkins and the people being sent to Parchment Prison with this idea that it's going to break people, but it has, Parchment has the opposite impact, right? Like people are I don't want to say that they weren't broken because there was a huge emotional part, but the action didn't stop. And we see this, as you talk about the Freedom Riders and just bringing more and more people in, realizing that if they caved at pushback, then it would be over. So they basically had to meet force with nonviolent force. Like they had to meet force with more people and more commitment. And to me, that was so powerful. But I think that was the key transformation, and why this was so effective is that, you could be beaten and you'd go back the next day. You just show up, and there's story after person who experienced that, who the very next day was like, I'm back out there. And I was hoping that you could talk again to people who haven't had a chance to read your book yet. Like, can you talk about that and the power that had?
Well, you're reminding me of some other piece that I'm glad to remember this and talk about it. And this is something I'm thinking right now about, something that's not in my book, but I'm thinking of John Lewis, who was one of the Freedom Riders. And in his autobiography, his memoir, he talks about the experience of being in Parchment. He's in there with other Freedom Riders. And what happens to them is it becomes a school where they talk with each other, and it becomes a community within Parchman. And so that allows them to, my read of it is that is one of the things that allows them to get through. The Freedom Riders spent a few months there. So that's one of the things that allows them to do that. But then outside, and now this comes back to my book, the community in Mississippi, the African American community in Mississippi, is one of the things that I think sustains the movement and gives the young people a cushion, a place that allows them to come back, even though it is the situation is so rough with jailings and beatings, as you point out. I think it's the community that one of the factors that allows this movement to thrive. And Greenwood is a good example of that. It's one of the things that happened as the organizers persisted, because they wanted the movement or the people in the community to stand up, and they did. And there were people, I talk about June Johnson, who was a teenager in Greenwood, whose mother was very reluctant to have her involved in the movement. But as she sees, as June's mom sees her involvement, she is moved and supports her daughter. And that's one of the amazing things that happens that sustains the movement, and for me is one of those ideas related to democracy. Democracy is connected to community.
Mm-hmm. It really is. A couple of things struck me during the Greenwood portion of the book, and it's silly, but having picking up people and stuffing them in garbage trucks. I think, to me, it would be over. For anybody that knows me, I have a keen sense of smell. Mm-hmm. And that probably would have been more torturous than anything, to be inside of a garbage truck that hadn't been cleaned in the heat, sweltering. I think the courage and the stamina, just as Kyla said, to get up once you're released that night to go back and, So I wanted to touch just a little bit on, we've been talking about democracy really the whole time in different forms, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And this notion that the reinventing of democracy that we talked about, and how it is a continuum, and that we all have to sort of stay on this path if we as a group decide that democracy is what it is that we want, right? And so I think about that. I think about Mary Hamer, all of the people with getting people to register to vote, and all of the blood and tears that were shed. And then fast forward to now, and sort of the landscape that we're in, the very same. It's just looks different. It looks a little more sophisticated, or neutrally, the policies seem to be neutral without, a disparity in the outcome of it, the voting laws that have been passed in different states here within the last year. And then I think about friends, colleagues, strangers, acquaintances who, yawning, voting, what's it, and it's just, it kind of brings me back to the beginning when we talked about history and why it's so important and why we have to understand and how we're asleep. Can you talk to us a little bit about democracy, voting, and why it is so integral?
Oh, yeah. We're seeing this on a local level, very, very much so on a local level, that no matter which side you're on, the school boards become very important. So we can see that very, very directly that we need to get out and vote. We need to pay attention to who's running, and we need to study that, and then we need to vote based on what we believe. And it seems like politicians are, in many ways, create the general atmosphere that we're living in, and so we certainly need to become conscious of who the people are that are running, so we can have a role in what's happening. But I would say, and I think this is part of the lesson beyond in Mississippi, we need to go beyond the voting. Voting is central and crucial, but we need to be speaking to a lot of issues. Like here in Pennsylvania, one of the big issues is gerrymandering.
Mm-hmm.
Districts are drawn in such a way to make the elections not fair. And so there's groups here that are very much involved in trying to have fair districts, districts where there are legitimate races. So we need to do that. The other thing I think of this, and this will be somewhat hopeful, I believe. Last May, I went to a Black Lives Matter march, and I was surrounded by young people who were very much moved, like the young people in Mississippi were, moved by and angered by what had happened with George Floyd. And speaking out in that way, then we start to have conversations about what kind of policing do we want to have. And we start to shape, then it's the people helping to shape the conversations that we need to be having.
I want to go back to something that you said, and maybe to give this context, I will just confess to all and sundry that I'm a new American citizen, brand new, 2021, brand new American. So I get to vote now. And so you said some things that I don't know if you saw my face, but when you talked about how important the school board was, I have spent a lot of my life in countries in which I didn't have a legal right to vote. And so when I think about voting, I think about, the president, I think about, senators or maybe my local city council, but talk to me about school boards. And I'm saying this not just for me, but also, I don't know how much, Renee, maybe you could talk from your perspective as a born American. Do you think about school boards as being like a critical vote? And maybe between the two of you, you can help me understand this and help viewers understand.
Wow.
Okay. Well, having been in education my whole life, school boards can impact what happens with teachers. And right now we're seeing school boards that are taking the state laws about critical race theory and threatening teachers in terms of what they can and can't teach, and how they're going to teach. That is that worries me. Certainly, I want to be clear that the school boards shape the general conversation, and they certainly, that's their role to in fact impact the general conversation. But digging into classrooms and mandating what teachers are going to do, that start to get into trouble. So it becomes really important that we pay attention to what's happening with school boards.
I have to say that I did not realize that school boards had that much power, and I'm just speaking, so this for me, and hopefully for people watching too, it is like a critical piece to come out of tonight. I don't know if you saw me physically be like, wait, what? So we have a question from actually, Renee, did you want to speak on school boards? I did invite you to.
I may have been born American, but I wasn't born in this country. My parents were Americans. They happened to be living overseas. I spent much of my early years, early education up, through college, university, really, in other countries. So I'm like you, Miss Canada, although I was American at birth. I just, so Bob is the expert.
All right. Well, it is. I mean, it's such, but it's another way that we have power in our hands. And I think that's a positive thing. And we have a question I'd like to bring to your attention. It's from Lorraine, who is asking, what was it about Mississippi that created all of these important people for the civil rights movement? Why this state?
That's wonderful. And I guess I don't have a complete answer. That's a question for long study. My sense is from just a piece of that, so my answer will be incomplete. I think the context of the world, of just how ugly that Jim Crow world was in Mississippi, that created a need to do something. I think also there's something that amazing about and I alluded to this before, the community in Mississippi, and in particular the African American community in Mississippi, that they formed a wonderful, powerful community. Didn't mean they agreed on everything, but they supported. The community itself supported the work of the civil people in civil rights. So that would be my quick answer to that. But I think that's a great question for a long study.
I have to say, I have the bad news of saying that we're almost out of time, but I have one quick question, which is, what age group? Like, I love this book. And we already know how old I am. But what is the age range? It's a book intended for young people, correct?
That's right.
What's the target age range of this?
Middle school to through high school, so grade 7 through 12. But as you're pointing out, I think as adults read it, I think they would learn some things that might surprise them.
Renee, do you have a quick question to close us out?
No, I just think everyone should. It doesn't matter what age you are. Everyone should read this book. It has something for all of us, and it's very well done. So thank you for this contribution.
Thank you.
It is a fascinating book, and one of the best ways that you can support authors is by buying their book. So you can get the book In the Name of Emmett Till by Robert Mayer at your favorite independent bookstore. If you don't have a favorite independent bookstore, the library sure does. And you can go to Loyalty Books that has branches in Washington, D.C., as well as Silver Spring, Maryland, and they will ship it to you. You can also get it from our friends, the library, PGCMLS.info. And if you don't have a library card, they will make sure that you get one. And so for the Office of Human Rights, we're so grateful that you joined us tonight. We're grateful for the library system. And Bob, it has been absolutely fantastic talking to you. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for this work, which we loved. And again, it's so full of energy and promise and inspiration, and that message that we all have a voice. And we see that through the work of these young people that you've captured so well. So thank you very much. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Bob. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And of course, thanks to our friends, the library and NewSouth Books. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.